It's a pleasure to share ideas with you at the Unither Nanomedical and Telemedical Technology Conference. If you have looked at or attended this conference for 2 years or maybe 3 years, it's really quite remarkable how fast the actual pace of change is. What started as somewhat theoretical ideas are already gaining traction in actual systems. They're still experimental, but they're actually working in vivo. And it's a very exciting area. It's on the cutting edge. In my mind, it's the third bridge to radical life extension. Dr. Grossman and I have written a couple of books which talk about these three bridges. The first bridge being what you can do right now, and that's the topic of another speech, but there's actually a lot more that you can do right now to slow down aging processes, and that's a moving frontier. The second bridge, which United Therapeutics itself, Martine's company, is a leader in, biotechnology, is the reprogramming of the information processes underlying biology. Biology is inherently an information process, but we didn't actually consider it that way. It was health and medicine and the related field of biology. It was basically just hit or miss. It was a grab bag of accidental discoveries, and as such, it progressed linearly. Now it's become an information technology. We have the software of life, the genome, which itself was an exponential progression in its collection. We have the means of changing genes in a mature individual, not just a newborn. We can turn genes off with RNA interference. We can add new genes with new forms of gene therapy, one of which United Therapeutics is in fact a pioneer in. United Therapeutics takes cells out of the body, lung cells, adds a new gene in vitro, inspects it got done correctly, then replicates that cell a millionfold. That's another new technology, injects it back into the body, goes through the bloodstream and ends up back in the lungs. So these are now your cells with your DNA, but with a new gene. And this has cured pulmonary hypertension in animal experiments. It's undergoing human trials. So we have the means now of updating this outdated software of biology. I mean, how long do you go without updating the software on your cell phone? This is probably updating itself as I speak, but I'm walking around with outdated software, and that's not a metaphor. That evolved thousands or millions of years ago, and it's out of date. The fat insulin receptor gene says hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. I would like to tell my fat insulin receptor gene, you don't have to hold on to every calorie. I'm confident I will have calories tomorrow. And in fact, that was done in animal experiments near where I'm speaking at the Joslin Diabetes Center. They turned that gene off. And these animals ate ravenously and remained slim, and it wasn't a fake slimness. They didn't get diabetes, they didn't get heart disease. They lived 20% longer. They got the benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite. There's several pharmaceutical companies rushing to bring that to the human market. And we can design these inventions on computers. We can test them out on biological simulators. So health and medicine, which up until recently was not an information technology, has now become an information technology. Why is that important? It's important because information technologies progress exponentially, not linearly. And that's not an approximation. They progress very predictably and precisely at an exponential rate. And I'll show you some examples of that just to show you how pervasive it is. But once something becomes an information technology, it progresses exponentially. Why is that different from linear progressions? Well, if you take 30 steps linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you get to 30. Take 30 steps exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, and that reflects the reality of information technology, you get to 1 billion. And this is not an idle speculation about the future. When I was a student at MIT, we all shared a computer. It took up half a building. In fact, I went to MIT because it had a computer. Most schools at that time didn't have one. It cost tens of millions of dollars, took up half a building. This computer is 1 million times cheaper, 100,000 times smaller, and 1,000 times more powerful than that computer we all shared when I was a student. That's a billion-fold increase in price performance. MIPS per dollar, bits per dollar, bits of communication per dollar. And we'll do it again in the next 25 years. And it's not just a matter of these devices we carry around. It affects everything we care about, like health and medicine, which has now become an information technology and is now subject to this phenomena, which I call the law of accelerating returns. So biotechnology, which is really the reprogramming of the information processes underlying biology, away from disease, away from aging, it's in an early stage today, but now that it's in information technology, it will progress exponentially, doubling in power about every year. So these technologies will be 1,000 times more powerful in 10 years, 1,000,000 times more powerful in 20 years. The golden era of biotechnology is perhaps 15 years away. According to my models, we'll then be adding more than a year every year, not just to infant life expectancy, but to your remaining life expectancy. So that's not a guarantee of living indefinitely, but it's a tipping point. The sands of time will start running in. We'll have to change our metaphors. So that's the second bridge. This conference is about the third bridge, which is also an information technology, applying nanotechnology to health and medicine. Because even if we reprogram biology away from disease and away from aging and optimize biology, it's still a suboptimal system. It's still based on proteins, which are folded up linear sequences of amino acids, a limited class of materials, and a limited class of kinds of reactions. An optimized biological system will still be far inferior to what we ultimately can re-engineer as we understand the basic principles of biology. And that's the promise of nanotechnology. Another exponential progression is the shrinking of technology. I've calculated that to be about 100 in 3D volume per decade. So systems will be about 100,000 times smaller than they are today in 25 years. So what fit inside a building when I was a student now fits in my pocket and is 1,000 times more powerful. What now fits in my pocket 25 years from now will fit inside a blood cell. So the quintessential application of nanotechnology, I used to call it the killer app, but that's wasn't such a good moniker for health technology. The quintessential application are nanobots, nanorobots, small devices the size of blood cells that go inside your body and perform therapeutic functions. And if that sounds very futuristic, it won't to the crowd at this conference. You only have to look at the other presentations in this conference to see that we're already doing very exciting things with the first generation of nano-engineered devices that are performing therapeutic functions already in animal experiments. Now, very often these are little devices, nanocapsules that can hold and release a medication. These devices will be 1 billion times more complex in terms of their feature complexity in 25 years. They'll have computers in them. They'll have intelligence. They'll be able to actually augment intelligently our immune system. Our immune system is intelligent. It's actually interesting how it works. You might wonder how these white blood cells can gain specificity against specific pathogens. They actually use an evolutionary process. They evolve a solution against specific pathogens. But it's a very slow process. I've actually watched one of my white blood cells attacking a bacteria on the slide, and it took about 2 hours. It's a very boring thing to watch. It was intelligent, but very slow and sluggish, and as is well known, our immune system is subject to all kinds of limitations, autoimmune disorders. We can create nanorobotic versions of this that can download new software from the internet to combat specific pathogens, won't be subject to autoimmune disorders, will be much stronger and much faster than our biological immune system, and that will be a very different era. That's the ultimate promise of nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is also an information technology. It is utilizing information processes to control and reorganize and re-engineer matter and energy at the molecular level to create new materials. That's the frontier we're on right now, but ultimately new devices that are actually nano-engineered. There's a whole emerging industry of three-dimensional printers. That's not nanotechnology today. The scale is about at the micrometer level. But ultimately, we're, as I mentioned, reducing this feature size at a scale of 100 in 3D volume per decade. We'll be down to the nanoscale in the 2020s, and we'll be able to actually print out very complex three-dimensional objects at the nanoscale. It's basically at the level of molecules that will be the long-heralded desktop factory that Eric Drexler first started talking about a quarter of a century ago. And this progression, this reduction of size, this increase in the price performance, scale, and bandwidth of information technology, the reduction of the size of technology in general, is a very predictable phenomena. It really belies the common wisdom that you can't predict the future. It's really remarkable just how predictable this phenomena is. And I'll show you quickly just a few examples of this to show you the pervasiveness and the predictability of this exponential growth. It's not an approximation when I say that, for example, the Genome Project doubled in scale every year. The total amount of genetic data we sequenced doubled every year. The cost came down by half. It's not an approximation. It wasn't 50% one year and 200% the next year and averaged out sort of roughly to 100% each year. It was exactly a doubling every year. And so skeptics dismissed the project halfway through the project. This is typical. People dismiss these exponential progressions when they're solving 1% of a problem. I predicted a World Wide Web connecting hundreds of millions of people to each other and to vast knowledge resources emerging in the mid to late 1990s. I made that prediction in the early 80s. People dismissed the ARPANET because it was a very small-scale phenomenon. The entire defense budget could only tie together a few thousand scientists. But that's the power of exponential growth. It happened right on schedule. And the Genome Project was dismissed halfway through the project because skeptics said you're halfway through the timeline and you've only sequenced 1% of the genome. That's typical for an exponential progression. You start out doubling little numbers. It looks like nothing is happening. But by the time you get to 1%, now you're ready for some real traction. They continue to double every year. 1% is only 7 doublings away from 100%, and the Genome Project was finished 7 years later, a year ahead of schedule. We see the same phenomenon now with solar energy. People dismiss it. Oh, it's only 0.5% of the world's energy needs. It's just a fringe player. It's nice, useful, but it'll never be significant. It's doubling every 2 years because of nanotechnology, because we're applying nanoscale processes to new solar panels and energy storage devices. As a result, the costs are coming down dramatically, and the total amount of solar energy is doubling not every year, every 2 years. But it didn't start 2 years ago. It started 20 years ago. It's already doubled 10 times, and it's now 0.5%. It's only 8 doublings away from meeting 100% of our energy needs. And I had this conversation with the Prime Minister of Israel recently at the Israeli Presidential Conference, and he said, well, do we actually have enough sunlight to do that with? And I said, actually, we have 10,000 times more than we need. We only have to capture 1 part in 10,000 of the sunlight that falls on the earth to meet all of our energy needs. And we will do that at very low cost within 16 years. So the next year, he made an announcement, which he based on our conversation, setting a 10-year goal to completely replace fossil fuels with solar energy and other renewables using Israel's best scientific leadership. And I told him afterward, I said 16 years, not 10 years, but he's being a little optimistic. But many people feel this will never happen or will take centuries because our intuition is linear, not exponential. We think in a linear way. That's actually hardwired in our brains. But the reality of information technology is exponential growth. And it's very unintuitive. But it makes a huge difference. As I mentioned, 30 steps linearly is 30 steps exponentially is 1 billion, and it makes a fantastic difference. And that's why my own predictions have been daunting to people, but I have enough of a track record, having started this 30 years ago, that many of these predictions are about the past now and have come true. And when they come to measuring these key issues of the basic fundamental measures of information technology, the size of various technologies, like the key feature size of semiconductors, or the number of MIPS per dollar and bits per dollar and bits being moved around on the internet. Those kinds of predictions have been very accurate because these are very smooth and predictable trajectories. And the final frontier of biology and health and medicine is really to re-engineer completely this very complex system. Now, biology is remarkable. It's very intricate. It's very clever. But it's full of downsides, as we've all noticed. We all have to spend a lot of time maintaining our bodies, and that's when things go well. And it's subject to a lot of disastrous scenarios. And ultimately, we are going to re-engineer, reverse engineer biology, and then re-engineer it. And there isn't a single organ you can talk about where there aren't already extensive projects to re-engineer, either to augment or to replace those systems, from the heart and artificial pancreases, artificial kidneys, portions of the brain. That's not just futuristic. There's an FDA-approved neural implant that replaces the biological neurons destroyed by Parkinson's disease. It's not blood cell size today, so we can't send it in non-invasively through the bloodstream, which we will do in 20 years. It's pea size, pretty small, but does require surgery. Already now, for 2 generations, we can download new software to the computer inside your brain if you're a Parkinson's patient. The latest generation, the software is actually quite complex, and there was a recent New York Times article expressing concern that people would hack into the complex software that people are downloading into their brains wirelessly. So that's today. If you go out 20 years, these devices really will be blood cell size. They won't just be experimental. These won't be just animal experiments. We will be augmenting and replacing biological functions with nano-engineered systems that go far beyond the capabilities of biology. As I've mentioned before, the respirocytes designed by Ron Friedis are about 1,000 times more capable in storing and releasing oxygen and carbon dioxide than our biological red blood cells. And if you replace a portion of your red blood cells with these devices, you could do an Olympic sprint for 15 minutes without taking a breath, or sit at the bottom of your pool for 4 hours. So these are the kinds of capabilities that we will be enhancing normal biology with by merging with non-biological systems through nanotechnology. So let me show you quickly just how pervasive and predictable a phenomena this is. In the case of computation, it goes back to the 1890 census, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the implications. Here I compare a linear progression to an exponential progression, and one reason that we confuse them is they look very similar at first because you're doubling little numbers. Exponential growth can even be sublinear at first, but ultimately it profoundly diverges from the intuitive linear perspective. And the ongoing exponential growth is made up of a series of S-curves reflecting different technologies. One of the objections to my thesis is that Kurzweil takes these exponentials and just projects them out, and we all know exponential growth can't go on forever. But it turns out that in information technology, once we reach the end of the line for a particular paradigm, the research community turns to creating the next paradigm. There's research pressure to create the next paradigm. And the ultimate resources needed to compute a bit or transmit a bit or to remember a bit is so vanishingly small that we can keep this process of going from one paradigm to the next and having a cascade of S-curves for a very long time. In the case of computation, we can see our way to doing that until late in the 21st century, when these technologies are trillions of times more powerful than the human body and brain. So if we look, for example, at computation, it's not just Moore's law. People think this exponential growth of information technology is Moore's law. They call it Moore's law. Moore's law is just one paradigm among several in computation, and computation itself is just one example of many of this exponential growth of information technology. Here we have over a century, going back to the 1890 census, of history of computers. And this is MIPS per dollar, and it has grown exponentially for, in fact, it's a double exponential, because on a logarithmic scale, a straight line is exponential growth. So we have another exponential here. It took 3 years to double the price performance of computing in 1900, 2 years in 1950. It was 12 months in the year 2000. It's now down to 11 months. But look at how smooth a trajectory this is. Now, this hides the scale because every level on this graph is 10,000 times greater than the level below it. So this reflects trillions-fold increase in the amount of computation you get per dollar, inflation adjusted, in a century. A billion-fold just since I was an undergraduate at MIT. But the most amazing thing about this graph is look at how smooth and predictable a trajectory this is. We have this graph through 2002 in my book, The Singularity is Near. What you're looking at has been updated to 2008. And you can see it has stayed right on course. In fact, I've been making these forward-looking predictions for 30 years. And nothing affected this. World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Great Depression, a lot of the recent economic downturn, none of that had any impact on this inexorable exponential growth, doubly exponential growth of computation. And it turns out this is true of every other form of information technology as well. Costs of a transistor has come down smoothly, exponentially. You can get one transistor for $1 in 1968. You can get 1 billion today for $1. But again, look at how smooth and predictable a trajectory this is. And as we've made them cheaper, they're better because they're smaller. And they have less distance for the electrons to travel. So they're faster. And the speed has gone up. The cost of a transistor cycle has come down by about half every year. That's a 50% deflation rate. And the economists worry about inflation or deflation. But we actually more than double our consumption of these technologies every year because when price performance reaches a certain level, whole new applications explode on the landscape. So here's bits shipped, but you could measure any other form of information technology. There's actually been 18% growth in constant currency every year for the last half century, despite the fact you can get twice as much of it every year for the same cost. In fact, this is what is driving economic growth. Biotechnology revolution I was talking about, but DNA sequencing costs coming down by half every year, the amount of genetic data doubling every year, and many other aspects of biology are scaling up in a similar fashion. Communication technology, deeply democratizing, many different ways to measure this. This is bits being moved around on the internet. We've had exponential growth in the total capacity of wireless networks going back a century to Morse code wireless transmissions up through the G4 communications of today. And that's going to continue indefinitely. Ultimately, we will send these devices in our bodies and brains. We'll have billions of them. They will be computing, but they'll also be on the cloud. So when if you talk to someone in 2035, you'll be talking to someone who's thinking with biological intelligence as well as non-biological intelligence. And the computers in their brain will be out on the cloud. So we'll be thinking out on the cloud, and we'll be able to communicate with each other out on the cloud. We'll have things like full immersion virtual reality from within the nervous system. We're shrinking technology at an exponential rate, which I mentioned, and that is really driving this nanotechnology revolution. And we're building these systems. There are now dozens of animal experiments, and some of which have been presented at this conference. We're performing already measurable therapeutic interventions in animals. Some of these devices are fairly simple. They're either nanoparticles or nano cages, nano containers that can release medications in a certain program fashion. The sophistication and scale of complexity of these devices is going to scale up exponentially. These devices will be really 1 billion times more capable in price performance in 25 years. They will be very sophisticated with computers. They'll be communicating with each other. They'll be on a wireless local area network. They'll be on the internet. And they will be able to greatly augment our biological capacity. We'll have nano-engineered white blood cells that can detect pathogens, download software to combat them, and do that in seconds rather than hours, as I mentioned. This is a video of Rob Friedis's nano-engineered red blood cell, a restrocyte. And as I mentioned, these will be thousands of times more capable than your biological systems. And we'll be re-engineering all of our systems using nanotechnology over the next several decades. We'll have plenty of computation as we go through this century. We'll be gaining the software insights from reverse engineering the human brain. We're increasingly using nanotechnology to increase the precision and scale of scanners. Non-invasive brain scanning is doubling its spatial resolution every year. The amount of data we're getting from these scanners is doubling every year. And we're turning this data into working models and simulations of brain regions. This is a block diagram of the auditory cortex. That's one of the visual cortex, the cerebellum, which is an important region, comprising half the neurons in the brain. That's where we do our skill formation, has been modeled and simulated. That's how we catch a fly ball. It controls our skill formation. We always wondered how a 10-year-old does that, because she has to solve a dozen simultaneous differential equations to catch a fly ball, and most 10-year-olds haven't taken calculus. We always wondered, how does that work? Well, the cerebellum actually does solve those equations. It collapses them using a mathematical process called basis functions, and we've actually reverse engineered that and simulated it and tested those simulations, and it works similarly to human performance. Most interestingly, projects like the Blue Brain project under Henry Markram are simulating substantial slices of the cerebral cortex. I was on a panel with him recently at this Israeli presidential conference, and I was actually the conservative on the panel because he expects that he will have a full human-scale simulation of the cerebral cortex by 2018. That may happen, but I think it'll actually take some more years to get it to work effectively, and we're actually also going to have to learn how to train it, because actually learning and education is part of the human brain's paradigm. So I'm sticking with 2029 for when we really will have reverse engineered the human brain, understand its principles of operation, re-implemented it with systems that can pass the Turing test. And the primary application is not some alien invasion from Mars to compete with us. We're going to use this technology the same way we use technology today, the same way I use this, even though it's not yet in my brain. It is making me smarter. I can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. And we're going to put these devices in our brain. We're going to augment our own intelligence. That's always been the role of technology. Ever since we picked up a stick to reach a higher branch, we've extended our reach with our tools. And first physically, now we already do that mentally. These devices are getting closer to us. It was across campus. I had to take my bicycle to get to the computer when I was a student. Now I carry it on my belt. It's going to make its way into our bodies and brains, and as they do, they're going to increasingly be at the nano scale. I'll just show you this for interest because it's just an example of the pervasiveness of this exponential growth, but here's the total production of solar energy, which has been doubling every 2 years for 20 years. Very smooth exponential growth on this logarithmic scale, and it's well on its way to, at very low cost, meeting all of our energy needs. So if we go out to 2029, nanobots will be ubiquitous. You've heard at this conference many other examples of the sort of first generation of nano devices that are being experimented with already in animals that can perform therapeutic functions. Scientists cured type 1 diabetes with a nano-engineered device that has 7 nanometer pores, lets insulin out in a controlled fashion and blocks antibodies, because type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder. And you've heard many other innovative projects along these lines at this conference. And if you've been following this conference, you can see already that the scale and precision and complexity of these devices is increasing very rapidly from year to year. 5 years from now, these will already be performing rather complex sequential operations, not just carrying and releasing a medication, but actually doing assessment and making decisions and intelligently carrying out its functions. The golden era, in my view, of nanobots, nano devices that have computers in them, that are robotic, that can carry out intelligent health-related missions, is about 20 years away, 25 years. It's about 15 years away for biotechnology. So these nano robots are really the third bridge to radical life extension, but ultimately They will be able to keep us healthy at the level of individual cells. They'll destroy disease or malfunctions or genetic errors at the level of one cell before it gets to the level of an organ and is life-threatening. They'll be able to reverse aging processes, and that really will dramatically increase life expectancy. We'll ultimately get to the point where these nano devices can go in and actually gather the information that make us up. If you ask, what am I? You say, well, Ray, you're not information. You're this physical stuff here, this skin and bones. Well, but that is actually information, because the particles flow through me. I'm a completely different set of particles than I was 6 months ago. And it's just like a river. I mean, is the river still there? Well, the water is completely different than it was a few seconds ago, but the pattern is the same. And we are a pattern of information. The particles kind of flow through that. And right now we have no way of backing up that information. If I drop this out the window and it smashes into pieces, I can recreate its personality because I've backed up its memory, its skills, and I can recreate it. It's not a metaphor to say that there's information in my brain. There's a brain file that constitutes my personality, my skills, my memories. But right now I have no access to that. I can reflect some of that by gathering documents and all my work product and videos, and I have that of my father, for example. But we really don't have direct access to the mind file. Ultimately, with nano devices, we'll be able to scan the brain in real time, actually back up the information that comprises our personality, skills, and memories, and that will add additionally to our life expectancy. People say, okay, then you really will be immortal, right? Because, the hardware could get smashed and you could recreate the information. But I will point out that information doesn't necessarily last forever either. If we forget about it, if we don't maintain it. Try going back now to some file that you forgot about and you stumble upon it. It's a WordStar word processing program. And you have it, but is that information still alive? You no longer have the WordStar program to run it on. You don't have the operating systems that WordStar required. There's no help desks. Maybe with a heroic effort you could access that information. But basically the moral is, if we don't care about information, it doesn't last. It doesn't live. And the same thing is true of our human bodies today. If we don't care about ourselves, we're not going to last that long. But if we're continually maintaining and updating and upgrading and taking advantage of the latest knowledge, we can keep the human body going a very long time and ultimately indefinitely. And we can keep information going indefinitely. And that's fundamentally what we are. That's the ultimate promise and goal of nanotechnology combined with artificial intelligence, is to be able to capture, retain, and preserve, and ultimately to enhance the information that is the basis for human existence. Thank you very much.